Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our November Training Tuesday event for OU Campus. Today's topic is third-party widgets and custom code. We're going to discuss the recommended steps for adding custom code snippets to your pages and XSL templates. To follow along, you should have a working knowledge of HTML. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode as the session is being recorded. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. This records your email so that we can follow up with you if your question warrants it. We will attempt to address your questions during the presentation. After the formal presentation has ended, we will review and answer all remaining questions. Your presenter today is Robert Kiffey, Senior Technical Support Engineer. Rob, I will hand it over to you.
So, quick backdrop. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Robert Kiffey, and I've been with the company for over 7 years, and been all over. Done, support stuff. Went over to pro services / implementations. Worked on a lot of projects getting people implemented, and I'm back over in support as kind of a higher level tech and doing a lot of the training for web developers that want to be more familiar with adding cool stuff to their websites. So here we go today with adding cool stuff to your websites. So one of the reasons we came up with this topic was that we got a lot of tickets coming in from people that were having some troubles adding some custom code, adding some third-party widgets, which are usually just scripts or bits of HTML. And either they just were having some troubles or they just weren't sure how to go about adding it. So anyways, so let's go ahead and talk about how we can do that. And just as a quick recap here of kind of just overview of what we're going to be doing, we're going to take a look at a particular use case, let's say Facebook Pixel, and see how we could go about adding that in. And then we'll talk a little bit more about maybe some more specific custom JS type stuff. So we'll get a little bit more advanced and more technical as we go. But then, depending on the time, which we should, we can talk about adding some custom PHP, and this will get a little bit more technical in that regards. And then we'll see how we're doing on time. But potentially we can answer some questions about if you are using code other than PHP and kind of some ways that we can configure the XSL for that. So if we don't get around to that, depending on the time of the questions and stuff like that, then certainly send in support tickets. We can assist you with any of those questions. In the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and go to a sandbox that I have, and I know this isn't representative to all of your particular setups. So keep in mind that things will be a little bit different, but again, if you have any questions, we're always here to help you and support. So hopefully the way I explain it, it will translate well enough. So we have a particular page, and let's say that we want to add Facebook Pixel to this particular page. Well, I have that code open up on another browser. Let me just drag that in, and you can see that I'm in the process of trying to add Pixel. And you can see that there's an option here to manually install the code yourself. And they give you some nice, actually, information about where it should go, how it should work. And that's all great, assuming that you were working with a complete HTML page. But in OU Campus, one of the benefits that we have is that we utilize special templates that involve XSL to build the structure of your page. So how do you get to these particular locations in your page? So let's take a back step, and let's go back and talk about a web page as a whole. Let's say some real basic code. You'll see that an HTML page basically is XML-like. And in fact, certain versions of HTML can even use the full XML syntax requirements, which just means that elements have to be well formed and properly nested and stuff like that. Browsers allowed people to kind of get a little bit lazy in their coding of the page, and so there's also HTML syntax that doesn't require some of that proper formatting. So we'll come back to that in just a minute. But if we take a look at what happens, there's basically a root element that's called HTML, and that tells us that this is an HTML page. And inside that, we're going to have two main nodes. We're going to have a head node, and that will open and close like that. And then we're going to have a body node, and we're going to open and close that. And what happens is that the items up in the head region are really just metadata items. They're information about the page. They're the settings and the properties and things like that, and that aren't necessarily visible content. But the body area is where we actually have the physical content. That's where we build the DOM of the page that gets loaded into the browser, and the browser interprets those particular elements and gives you a visual representation. So when these code widgets, ask you to add them to the page, there's usually a couple places that they might have you add them. So let's talk about where you might add those. The first is that most likely you're going to be working up in the head region. And so you might have, let's say, a title. You could have, some meta content, something like that. And this is where potentially you could have it close like that, or if you're working in the more proper syntax, then you'd have it self-close. But point is that a lot of these cases, you're going to have your CSS up here, and you're going to have some potentially might have some JavaScript up here. So this would be kind of your first spot that you might want to add some code. And so this is, a nice spot to put it because it's up outside of the DOM. It gets loaded, when the page is basically first loaded. And this is, a case where you usually put a lot of your CSS, et cetera, for helping render the page. So this is a common spot that you're going to want to add scripts. Now, the other two kind of common locations are going to be at the top of the body. And this actually is less common because there's usually not too much reason to add something there when you could hide it kind of in the head region. But it is a spot. I suppose I could have copied and pasted that. But the other final spot, so let's say we just have a little page heading there. The other final spot is right at the closing body. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is that it's possible that some of the scripts that you want to add make use of jQuery libraries, or it's JavaScript that's basically expecting to work on content that lives above it. And the reason is that, and so if we add my comment for what I'm talking about, so you have your kind of three spots. But the reason for this final one is for a couple reasons, as I mentioned. One is that if you have any JavaScript that's going to directly affect the page without kind of waiting for the page to load, the nice thing is that it comes in at the very end. So you can refer to things that are already loaded into the DOM before it basically fires. So that's one kind of reason. The other reason is if you are using some kind of like a jQuery library or something like that, you want to make sure that that's loaded before your scripts load, because that way the jQuery information is available to the JavaScript when that basically is run. Now, in a lot of cases, people will actually move in some of those big JavaScript libraries or a lot of their JavaScripts down to the bottom of the page as a way to increase your page load time. And it's not necessarily that it's going to overall increase your page load time, but it basically makes the DOM load a little bit faster in the browser, and so it appears like your page is loading a little bit faster, and that can be helpful for pages that have a lot of stuff going on. And so that's a common reason why you might see a lot of scripts that come down in that closing body. So hopefully that kind of helps explain. Now the trick is, how do we get to these particular spots with our PCF XSL templates? So that's where we have to know a couple things about how we do our implementations. And keep in mind that things have slowly changed over time. But for the most part, we've been doing this consistently for many years now. And so most of you listening in should probably have something very similar to what we do now. And if you don't, feel free to check in and we can help you set that up. But the trick is that in most cases of our PCF XSL templates, the PCF or your normal pages really only have access to the common, not to the common, but to the things that are specific to that particular page. So really, this is kind of your block of code that you actually have access to within your PCF page. So how do you get to these kind of spots, you know, to add these scripts in? And that then goes to the next question that you might have to ask is, are you adding something specifically to one page, or are you adding it so that it goes to many pages? And in that case, that's going to lead you to two different locations. One, if it's going to many places, then you're considering either putting it into the XSL, or if you have an include file already set up, then that's the most logical place. So, for example, if we take a look at the Google Pixel code, you can see that it's asking you to add it into the right before this close head, and it's saying to insert it there. So I have to basically copy this to my clipboard. Okay, and then what I need to do is I need to go back to OU Campus, and I need to somehow add that into the head region of my content. Now, that particular code is going to be reused across multiple pages. So in this case, I need to go and I need to add this to all of my stuff. Now, without going into too much XSL, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into Common XSL, which is where we typically build the majority of our page, the page structure that is. And as you can see, we have our HTML tag, we have our head tag here, and then we've got some meta content and things like that. But what we've done is we've have this little function here that writes an include to an include file. And so in here we have this head code include, and that's basically an easy way for you to go and update content that goes into that head region that would be consistent across all your pages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open another tab. I go into my includes folder, and in here I should have my head code include. And if I click source, you can see that it's just basically a bunch of CSS. So what I can do is I can just go ahead and paste that code right into my head code include file. And then I can save it. And then I'll probably want to publish it too. So I'll just say added pixel code. Okay, and then from there, I'm going to go to my back to my page that I wanted to test. And if I click preview, this is kind of more advanced, but if I click right-click on it and I go down to view frame source, it's a little bit different on Firefox and some of the browsers. You might have to go to this frame and then view source or something like that. But if you go to the view frame source, you can basically then get an idea of what the XSL is building as your final HTML output. This might be a little bit small. Let me zoom in a little bit. We can see that we have our HTML element here, and we've got the head element as well, and we've got a bunch of stuff in there. And here we have our Facebook pixel code that we just added in. So as we can see, that's already being added in via that include, and that's automatically going to go out to all pages that are set up to use that particular XSL, and thereby that include file. So, so that part is done. We're good. But if we go back to our pixel code, then what we can do is we can hit continue, and this is where we can maybe add some specifics to maybe perhaps I want to get a little bit of information about some contact links. So what I can do now is I can copy this to my clipboard. And the trick is that this is going to go into a particular page. So this is going to be something that I want to go to, just this one page that I'm working on. The trick here you can see is that it's going to go into the body, and then basically right after that opening body tag. So to get that to work is going to require that we have a particular setup in our XSL, which, as I mentioned, has been pretty consistent for a while now. So what that means is that if we take a peek at what's going on in the XSL, what's happening is that we are doing this little apply templates, it might be even a copy of, to this head code node, and that's coming from the PCF. And so if we go ahead and take a look at the PCF file here, and we click source, you'll notice at the top that we have these 3 nodes that we have created. And there's nothing specific about them in OU Campus. There's no like special properties to them. They're just container elements that we've pre-set up in the need that you might want to add some specific code to an individual page. Well, guess what? I have some code that I want to add. And the 3 spots, as I mentioned, should align back to our HTML, my little mock HTML page. So here's the first, here's the second, and here's the third. And so the idea is that the first one's going to be for the head code. There's a body code that's going to go right in at the opening body. And then there's a foot code that's basically at the very bottom, technically like where your footer would be. And so that matches up to those particular locations in your HTML output. So in our case, it asks for us to put it into this body code. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in. As you can see, there's a little bit of an alignment stuff with that, but it really doesn't need to be too perfect. We can just go ahead and hit save. Okay, and then again, if I just do this view frame source real quick, you can see that right down here, let me zoom in a little bit. Right after the body tag, it threw in that script that was needed for Pixel. So that's kind of in a nutshell for adding different things to your pages. You've got stuff that you need to add to global so that multiple pages can get it. And then you've also got ways that you can add it to page specific things into those kind of 3 main, specific spots. That kind of covers some of the basics for at least the locations. The next part is what happens if you want to add some custom code. Let's say you want to write a specific JavaScript for this particular page, and perhaps you might have had some troubles getting it, to operate the way that you want. Let me go ahead. There's some questions that come in. So before I step into that fully, let me see if I can answer some of these questions. So first, we've got a question from Ivanka. Can you show us the include file function? So this goes back to the XSL. And this is where I mentioned that we had this include statement that basically allowed us to write an include link to a location. Keep in mind that our way that we've written this function has kind of changed over time. So you might see it with all lowercase with a dash in between. So something like this. This is the newer approach that we've been doing. The older approach was the camel case. That's what I have in my sandbox here. So the look of it might be a little bit different, but really all it is the function that takes in a root relative path to an include file destination. And all it does is it writes basically 2 things. One is it writes the OU tags to get OU Campus to preview that include file in staging when you do your preview. And then it also writes the server-side code to get that to actually work when you publish out the file. And that's based on your particular setup. So if you're using PHP, it'll use a PHP include. If you're using like an Apache or a .NET basically include, then it would be like the comment with the hashtag lost it, virtual, with just hashtag include, there we go, with either file or virtual equals with the path. So I can go into that a little bit more detail later if you like, but for now, just know that we should have that option, and if you need help getting that set up, just send in a support ticket and we can get you more information on how that works. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Next one is, after changing the include, do we need to republish the entire site? So that depends on where you added this code. So in our case, we added it to an include file, and an include file by definition typically means that that include is being picked up via server-side code, like a server include, as I mentioned here. So therefore, the advantage of that is that when you republish just that one include file, it will automatically update all of your live pages that are using that include. So in that sense, you are basically able to update everything with just that one publish. Now, if you updated the XSL, so let's say that we did have to add something directly in, and we'll talk about this in just a second, then at that point you would need to republish pages because they need to use that new XSL to get that new content out to the production server, because that happens as part of the transformation when it publishes. So, so hopefully that also helps explain that question. So, yeah, so let's go back to talking a little bit more specifically about some of the more advanced kind of scripting that you might want to add into some pages. Now, not necessarily that you're writing, specific scripts. Let's say you're getting it from some location. Let's say like a calendar has a little widget or something like that, and you just want to add it into, let's say, a particular spot on your page. So in our case, I'm going to just demo it by writing a real simple script, basically up, and we can just throw it up into this head code spot. And so if I do something like, actually, let's not do it in the head code. Let's do it where we had the other one. I've already got a script tag here, so we can just kind of tie onto that if we want. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw a little alert in here, and we can just see what's going on. So if I just do testing like that, and I click save, basically what's going to happen is JavaScript's going to throw the alert, and it's going to show up on my page just like this. So you can see the little indication in my text, testing text, whatever. So I click OK, and it finishes rendering, all good. So what happens when that code gets a little bit more complicated? So if we come back, and let's say now that I have some variable, I'll just call it test, and let's say that that equals 4, okay? And then we have, let's say, a test condition, and we want to only show this alert if that test condition is true. Now, this is pretty silly logic because it's all made up. But in a lot of cases, you're going to get code that's kind of minified. You don't necessarily can't read it, but it might have some characters that might throw things off a bit. So, for example, if let's say we wanted to just do a check to see if test was equal to 4, then that gives us a straight that should be true, right? Because we just set it to 4, and so we should still be able to see our test. Oops, wrong button. Oh, I messed up with some PHP in there. JavaScript doesn't use the $ in front of it. I was ahead of myself. So let's try that again. Okay, now my testing alert shows up. I blame it on my twins, you guys. My brain's not working the way it used to. Okay, so that part seems fine. Everything's good so far. So you could see that you could get a decent amount of JavaScript in there that potentially wouldn't have any problems. But let's say we just do a simple check of greater than. So now we're just checking to see if it's greater than or equal to 4. So that means that should still be true. And so we should still see our alert. However, as soon as I hit save, well, let me see here. Maybe it's, yep. Hold on a second. I have a feeling that I did that. There we go. I think this is what I was trying to do here. So if it's less than 5, let's try that real quick. There we go. Okay, so I had the wrong character. My brain flipped things around again. So the reason for that is that the PCF engine, or excuse me, the XSL engine is basically reading an XML file. You can see that this is XML file. And so what's going on is that XML has a very specific syntax requirements for how the characters basically and everything in here is written out, because it thinks that these are specific elements. These have to be known elements. So when I open with a a less than sign, it thinks that I'm writing a new element to the page. And it doesn't really know what a script is. It's just basically saying, oh, you need to, this is improper syntax. So what's happening is, as soon as I write that, then I get a PCF error, and it's basically just telling me that that there's a syntax issue with it, and it should give me the line number. So if I go back to preview, you can see on line 16. So there's a little bit of troubleshooting here, and here's line 16. Sometimes you might need to work backwards from those errors. So like let's say something happens at the end, and that's where it finally goes, oh, that's an error, even though it might have happened previously up in your code. So it's always just a point for you to work back from. But in most cases, it'll be pretty accurate about where it is. So how do we get around this type of issue? I mean, well, I could try to change my logic around so that it was, greater than or something like that, which the greater than is okay because it's not quite as indicative of that you're trying to open a new element. It's kind of interesting that one throws an error and the other one doesn't. But in this case, the less than does. So what happens if I do have some code? I don't necessarily want to go rewrite it. Potentially it's not my own. So how can I get around this potential issue? Well, the easiest one that I've seen is that you basically, and this is something that came up from working in XML, is that you can use this thing called CData. And so what the trick is that you basically just wrap the content that you want in CData tags, and then the system will basically just ignore it as, regarding its syntax requirements. But the trick is that you have to do it in a way that it's not going to mess up the JavaScript, right? So when this goes through to the browser doesn't want to try to read that CData in its JavaScript code. It wants to basically just read JavaScript. So you have to trick the system. And so the way you do that is you make a comment, so a single line comment. You can do a double, you could do an extended comment if you want. But you basically just open it up, do your CData. Oops, I always mistype it. Okay, and then you can see that the system will turn it purple, indicating that you've got something special there. And then what you do is you basically take the closing tags and you Control X. I just got, saved them first. And then you go down to the bottom of your code and you add your comment in again, and then you close that CData tag. So what's happening is that to the XML in the XSL engine, it's going, oh, here's a script tag, okay? And then here's a CData tag. I don't care about these slashes, this is just text, but here's the CData. So I'm gonna ignore all the content that's inside that and treat it just as text that, I don't have particular requirements on. And so therefore, it passes that and it lets that be fine. And I can verify that by just testing like that. So now all of a sudden, that's good. But to the browser, when this gets published out, when it tries to interpret this script with JavaScript, it goes, oh, this is a comment. We can ignore this line. And we come down here, oh, this is a comment. We can ignore this line. So it's kind of a convenient a way to basically allow you to get some custom JavaScript that might have some syntax things that might interfere with how the XML and XSL system works. So that's just a quick tip on that. So there was a question about using an entity. Entity would be like, let's say, greater than or less than example. And the idea is that you can do this, but you would need to set your XSL up to basically reconvert that out as a basically, you have to unescape it for the JavaScript to process it. And that depends on some specific settings in your XSL. And it's possible that we might have set that up for some of the customers, depending on how it was originally. And so you're welcome to try that. But keep in mind that there could be lots of cases where you've got some particular entities that would need to be converted, and it might be a pain to go through and try to change all of those particular elements or characters. So in that case, wrapping your entire script with the C data should be a little bit easier in that sense. And if you have any other specific questions or issues, with some of that, you can always check in with us and we can try to work around it. Of course, if you do have something that just doesn't seem to work, remember that you could always move that JavaScript to another JS file, publish it out, in your resources folder, etc. And then all you need to do is just reference it with a script tag. And don't self-close it. It just basically closes with nothing inside it. But basically, you can then just go in and then insert the path to, let's say, a particular script. And that's always another way that you can get around and just moving it off of that and then putting it in a separate file. And there might be some advantages of doing it that way in general, as opposed to just hard coding it into your page. So hopefully there's a couple tricks there for that. Another question we've got: with scripting JavaScript C data portion on our site is all HTML5. The HTML5 scripts are interpreted as JavaScript default. So how do we need C data to pass through to the XSL parser? So I don't think that it has to do, maybe I'm misreading your question, but I don't think that it necessarily has to do with the HTML5 aspect of it. It's more of the fact that this is an XML page, and so the script elements, the XSL engine basically doesn't know that that's a particular JS script that can use characters that aren't representative of normal XML syntax. And so this is basically a way to get around the XSL requirements before it even gets out to your production C data and stuff like that. So I don't know if that maybe answers it, but it's more of this is something that you can do as a way to protect characters inside an XML file versus something that you're trying to do to protect it from HTML5, if that answers that. Okay, so if there's no other questions, also Steve, if that doesn't answer your question, feel free to check in later and we'll get back with you. So moving on, we've wanted to talk about how we could add, let's say, some server-side code. So that's where things get even a little bit more tricky. So how would we do that? So there's kind of two common places that you might want to do this. Of course, if you're building it into your template, you might want to build it into the XSL. In that case, I can actually just take you to an example of where we're doing that in this particular sandbox code. And how it does, and this is more XSL specific, so I wasn't trying to go into too much of that today. But as you can see, we just basically write this XSL processing instruction, and that tells it to write this particular syntax, less than question mark. And otherwise, the XSL or the XML basically treats that as, oh, that's something specific to this particular page, like a comment type thing, right? And so it's not going to treat it as XSL. And so what we have to do is we have to, or basically the XSL gives you an instruction or a element that will write that particular set of characters. And then you can make it specifically PHP by giving it this name PHP, and then that writes it the right way. Now there's an interesting thing about that, and that's that if you are using HTML5 or HTML output in general, then for some reason the engine basically fails to write the closing question mark before it ends the PHP node. So if you didn't have that, it would look like this, you know, and you'd have your code in here. And so what we have to do is we just have to manually add that back in so that it works normally like PHP. And so that's why you see this, and there can't be any spaces. It has to be right before this closing thing. And it's just a weird quirk of this accent engine. Keep in mind that if you're doing XML output, or if you're doing XHTML output, or some of the other output methods, that's not an issue for those. So it's just something to keep in mind. Again, I don't want to go into that too much detail. If you have questions, feel free to check in. But the idea is that once you have written this code at this point is just PHP code. So you could throw in your PHP, and the nice thing is that the system then recognizes this as PHP, and you can get away with some of the more different characters and stuff like that. So without going into too much more of the XSL, I will backtrack out of that. And what I want to show you instead is potentially, you know, throwing it into a PCF page. So I'll leave that, except that I might change my logic here so this doesn't stop popping up on me every time I want to save and preview the page. So the next step is let's get some PHP onto this particular page. And in this case, I want some PHP that's specific to the page. So if we go to edit, you know, this is where we would normally want to edit this particular content. I could come into here, and then I'd say, oh, okay, I want to write some special PHP that's going to do something right here. So how do I do that? Well, first is that you could try to click on the source code, and you could add it in. Okay, I'll just throw that in there. Okay, and I believe that that's something that I can't remember if the now I can't remember if that's something that I think the WYSIWYG editor does do for us, and it kind of lets us know that there's something there. Keep in mind that you can backspace up and potentially get rid of it. So you don't necessarily want to do this for pages that a normal end user would still be, or a content editor is still going to be editing, unless they know to be careful of that. So that goes, well, you know, how do I add, you know, that so that it's a little bit more protected? The old classic used to have like a code protect, but it still had the same thing about, you know, being careful about backspacing and stuff like that. So really the best way in this sense is that you'd probably want to go to an asset. So if I open a new tab, I go to assets, and then maybe I'll create new. I'll do source code, and I'll just say that this is a PHP test. Okay, sure, it's just my sandbox, but most likely you'll probably want to lock that down. And then you can come in and you can add this in this way. Okay, so I create that, it's all good, publish it just so that it's available to me. Okay, now I can come back to my editable region, and then now I can go to insert asset, and then I'll go find my PHP test. Okay, and now it's protected. Okay, so now it's in a spot where it's still visible in the WYSIWYG, but it's not going to be easily overwritten. It's not going to show anything in preview, because remember, we don't process the server-side code in OU Campus. But if we publish it and preview my page, you can see that that test came through and that code processed. So that's all great. So that's kind of the first step, is that, yeah, you probably, if you do have some custom code, probably the safest way to handle it is to put it into a source code asset and then drop it in that way. And ideally, you can make your source code, scripts reusable, and so that way you can use them on other pages. If not, you lock down the asset and make sure that only certain people can actually use it. So there's that. And now what happens if we can just do a little bit of testing here. Let's do some similar. So if and we'll just give us a little indicator that something worked. So we can do test equals 4, something similar here. And if we do, so this is where I was remembering the $sign. So here's the one that gave us an issue before. So if we say that it's less than 5, okay. Now I could, in theory, I could come in here and get some syntax highlighting for this. And it'll format it a little bit better for me. Everything should be okay here. Echo test 2. I don't see any problems at the moment. I tend to make a lot of mistakes lately. And we'll publish that out again. Okay. Now, because it's an asset and I republish the asset, it should automatically republish on my page. And as you can see, that code worked just fine, test 2. So note that code that's in a PHP element like that, even though this code is being directly pushed into the XML file, so even if I were to go ahead and do it this way, where I manually paste it into that content region, let's say right where that asset is, we're still going to be okay because of how it recognizes those particular script tags, basically the processing instructions. Okay, so so if you do have any issues with those, let us know, and we can work with other ways to handle it. But for the most part, you're going to be somewhat okay. Now you might get to a point where, now of course I got rid of my asset, so I need to go back and add it again for my next phase here. Okay, so let me just republish that. That way we have our asset. Okay, so now the next thing is that perhaps you have some different PHP that traditionally is more done directly on the final output, worked intermixed with the HTML. You could get something that looks like this, where let's say you're building an A tag, you have an href, and then inside that href is where you're trying to build your PHP output. Wait. Okay, and then okay, so it's possible you could get some stuff like this. Let's say we just do let's just make it a slash to the root, and then we'll say test. Okay, so kind of a dynamically built link. Maybe not necessarily the best way to do PHP, but there are certainly, reasons for why you might get some code that does some stuff like this. So if we save that and publish it, okay, you'll notice that we actually got an issue. And so if I come back to my page, you can see that there is an issue here. And that's because while the certain character was okay in the PHP, the fact is that we ended up breaking the XML syntax requirements by throwing this tag inside an attribute. And while that's okay on an HTML page, because ultimately the server is going to process that before the browser ever sees it, it's gonna be a problem here in our code because the XML is going to see that code before it gets processed. So in this case, there are only so many different ways we can get around this issue. The first is a little bit of a hack, in my opinion, but it's kind of an interesting way, is that you could set up a special XSL template match where you basically put all this into a comment, and then therefore, in the PHP syntax here, but if I come back to just XML, the system will basically just think this is all just one big comment. And then what you have to do is you have to have a template match that basically matches comments that have this PHP tag in it. And then you can basically strip the comment out of it and dump that code out into your final output. And that actually works. You have a couple issues. One is that you can't have the minus, the double minus in there, because then it goes, oh, you're trying to close the comment. So that's a little bit of a trick. And I don't necessarily recommend that unless it's a worst case. You really need to do this type of thing. And if you are interested in that, I can certainly get you the information on how to do it. The other option is that keep in mind that all this code is PHP, right? You have PHP available. If it's other server-side code, something similar. What might make the most sense is really just to move it off to another file if you're trying to do a bunch of complex stuff. That way you can work on a single point, and you can basically just write your include statement to that file. And that's probably the easiest way to get around the issue without having to go into a lot of advanced XSL. And you know, there's nothing wrong with this. It's still code that you drop in, and then it basically gives you access to all the code from that include file. Yeah, so that's a traditional way to get around it. Now, I'm going to answer or kind of bring up a question and then answer it without going into too much detail. But for those of you that are working in JSP or ASP.NET, et cetera, you guys are trying to use something like this. And it's like response.write, blah, blah, blah. Now, I'm not working on a .NET server right now, so this won't do anything if I publish it out. But the idea is that your code gets embedded into these characters as opposed to the processing instruction that has the question mark. So the problem with this is that immediately those characters you're going to see are not allowed. And so there's a couple ways that you can get around it. And usually when we set people up with those setups and they have those requirements, we'll usually set up a template match that looks for something and then writes those particular characters. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either create like a special tag that you could say like, you know, C# or something like that. But my favorite is basically doing this, where you just basically do like ASP. And it basically then you have a template match that matches a processing instruction of ASP. And then in the output, you basically convert it over to the special less than % sign instead. And then that way you get all the benefits of as if you're writing in PHP, but you know, the system will automatically convert it for you. It's a little weird and it's a little complicated, but that's just kind of a quick option for that. You can also do the comment trick for more advanced stuff similar to the PHP. But yeah, so I think that's going to be enough for today. It's 11:50, and I would like to open it up for any other questions. I'll go ahead and just go to my thing here. I thought I had a Q&A page, but this will have to do it for now. Does anybody have any questions about what I went through? I know I answered some of the questions on the way through. Okay, so here's a question. Why wouldn't you just put all scripts in includes and let assets call them? So you're clear on syntax always. are assets better to use? So yeah, so it just depends. In most cases, if stuff's going to be reused, perhaps it's best to just throw the scripts into your includes directly. And that's fine. However, there might be cases where, let's say, you're trying to test something on a test page and you don't want to go ahead and automatically throw it into an include. Perhaps you are working on something that's going to be on just one page, right? And that's a case where potentially you don't want to necessarily throw it into an include. Now, if we're talking about like what we did before with the PHP and perhaps it made more sense to just throw it in and include that way, that's fine too. It's just personal preference. One, you'll get a bunch of scripts kind of thrown into a particular location of your site, and you'll just have to know that those are being used on one or more pages. Whereas some people might prefer that it's on the page itself, and that way it's a little bit easier to get to and edit, instead of having to kind of take a couple steps to get there. So there's going to be potentially reasons for both, but I agree with you, for a consistency purpose, it might be, if you know that you're going to have to go to the approach where it goes to the includes, perhaps it's best to just teach that as your best practice. But in this session, I just wanted to show you the different ways possible, and it's up to you guys to kind of pick your favorites for what works for all the things that you guys are going to do. Thank you, Megan. Anybody else with some questions? I use mock forms for forms on the site, currently using an iframe snippet to embed on particular page. They recommended using their JavaScript code over the iframe. Do you have their best practice for embedding their JS, C data, etc.? So that should be similar to what I showed you with the pixel. So you'll probably, if it's a page specific thing, right, for a particular form, you probably will throw it into one of those locations. If it really does go into, like, you have to throw the JavaScript. So let me just demonstrate that real quick. Most likely it's Most likely it's a combination of things. You're going to have potentially something that will need to go up into the head or the foot, to basically add the library. And then you're going to want to throw something in at the actual content location so that the form knows, it knows to build the form in that particular spot. Now, in most cases, they make it so it's really easy and you just dump all of it into that one spot. But if you did have the combo of the two, then you'd throw, let's say, the supporting scripts up into one of these three elements at the top of your PCF, and then potentially the form portion of it would go down either somewhere in the content area of that region, either as an asset, right? You might throw it in an asset, or potentially, you could just put it right in, assuming that nobody else is going to edit that page or something like that. But in reality, it should be pretty similar. And if there is any special characters and stuff, the C data trick should work. And feel free to check in if for any reason that's not working. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. Okay, another question. Our system was implemented way back when, and even our header and footer are not includes. I wish that wasn't so. Yes, so we've gotten better as we go, and so there might be some cases where you don't have those common includes set up. The thing is they're not too hard to add. So feel free to send in a support ticket, and we can either walk you through it or at least kind of point out how to do it. Ultimately, what happens is we basically just write one line of code here with this include statement, because there are going to be some includes. You're going to have an include for your header. You're going to have an include for a footer. I can't imagine that we didn't have it. So there's a way that we got includes working before. And so you basically just use that same code, but just have it point to a new file. You go to that location, you create the file that matches, and then you can put your stuff into there. Keep in mind that you'll need to republish your pages so that it uses that include going forward. And keep in mind that if you do change the XSL, It is safe as an administrator if you're publishing multiple pages, you're doing a folder publish or even a site publish, that you can do this use last published version. And that's going to reuse the last published PCF, the copy of the PCF. System stores a copy or version of that PCF file, but it's always going to use the latest XSL. So that is a safe way of republishing all your existing content with the new XSL, the new design updates, etc., but still using the existing content without worrying about pushing content that's not ready. So yeah, so hopefully that answers that for now. It's a quick question. Okay, when you were looking at Facebook pixels, that's something we all have available. To be honest, for this presentation, I pulled it up on my own personal thing. If you need help, you can check in, but most likely, if you just look into Facebook, they'll give you the links to get it started, you can look into it from there. So I don't know if that answers that question at all. Okay. Thanks. Oh yeah. So you're welcome on the tip for the last published version. No, it's a handy tool when you're making XSL changes, because you especially most of the time when you're working on XSL, it's going to affect a bunch of pages, and you don't want to necessarily have to go manually publish them and potentially push out content that's not ready, or have that page waiting, without the updated look because you're waiting for some content to get ready. So this is a useful tool. Okay, so there's a question in the chat that I missed. Okay, what is the best approach to pass an XSL variable to some JSP for processing? Okay, so this is a question for pushing XSL information to your server-side code. So if I come back to my PHP here, it's going to be somewhat similar for JSP. Just that you won't use this processing instruction. You'll use something like this. You'll use this text with the disable output escaping. Equals yes or true or whatever. Or let's see. Yeah. What this does is it basically, we're going to encode the characters because that way they're not a problem to the XSL. But when it actually pushes it out and it transforms it, this basically tells it to unencode it. And so what we can do is you do something like this. You do less than, and then your percent sign. And then that way you don't have that issue. So that essentially creates your opening and closing indicators, and then from here you'd add your code in. So that just gets you through that portion. Again, that's all essentially what this is doing with the PHP, and then you just have your code inside. So a little bit more, a couple more steps. But ultimately what happens is that you want to pass information into here. All you have to do is just do your normal output. So let's say I want to create a variable, and I'm not going to pretend there are no JSP syntax off the top of my head. So let's go with the PHP. A little safer here so I don't have obvious errors. So what I can do is I can create a test variable. And then let's say it's going to store a string. So I'll go ahead and prep it as if it were going to be a string. And then in here, I can actually just go ahead and throw in my XSL statements. And of course, it's trying to help me by closing that for that, only because I mistyped it at the start. Be careful, because when you sometimes correct that stuff, you might lose some of those things. So you just want to make sure that you have those quotations still live there if you expected them to be there. And then in here, you could basically output, you know, some kind of, probably count's not a good example here, but either way, you could throw some XPath, do some logic, get some value from the PCF, etc. And then basically this is going to push that on the transformation. It's going to push it out into this particular variable statement. And if you're working with a number, so if it was a number, then you probably wouldn't want the quotes because you do want that to come down. And so maybe you're trying to see how many profiles there are or something like that. You know, so you could pass through XSL information to your server-side code in this manner. And it's really usually just value of, but you could do more advanced stuff with the XSL. Just know that the XSL is treating this as text, and so you're basically just embedding your XSL code into that text content, if that makes sense. Let me know if you are trying to do something specific, but that doesn't, you know, that what I just mentioned doesn't address it. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question, Josh. Was there any other questions? I think we're good here. My twins are almost 16 months, and sleep is rare, but we're doing good. Thanks. Almost through the hard part. Okay. I think without further ado, let's go back to this right here. And just remember that we're going to take a break on December. And so we'll probably come back and do another one of these in January. And we'll give you more information before then, of course. I unfortunately can't hear you, Erica, if you're talking, but I will go ahead and pass it over to you. Thank you.
All right, yes, as Rob said, we are taking a break for December for the holidays, so our next Training Tuesday will be in January in the new year. So keep an eye out on all the usual platforms for what our topic will be. And thank you everybody for attending. The recorded presentation and materials, PowerPoint slides, and any sort of additional code or resources will be available on our support site and the OCN. And before you leave, don't forget to fill out the feedback survey that pops up once you close the webinar. We love hearing from you guys, and it helps us tailor our Training Tuesdays to what you want to see. Thank you everybody for attending, and have a great rest of your day.